The Franks are historically first known as a group of Germanic tribes that roamed the land between the Lower and Middle Rhine in the 3rd century AD, and second as the people of Gaul who merged with the Gallo-Roman populations during succeeding centuries, passing on their name to modern-day France and becoming part of the heritage of the modern-day French people. Some Franks raided Roman territory, while other Frankish tribes joined the Roman troops of Gaul. In later times, Franks became the military rulers of the northern part of Roman Gaul, with the coronation of their ruler Charlemagne as Imperator Romanorum by Pope Leo III in 800 AD. He and his successors were recognized as legitimate successors to the emperors of the Western Roman Empire. In this way, Romance speakers came to be seen as Franks in some contexts. The Salian Franks lived on Roman-held soil between the Rhine, Scheldt, and Meuse rivers in what is now northern France, Belgium and the southern Netherlands. The kingdom was acknowledged by the Romans after 357 AD. Following the collapse of Rome in the west, the Frankish tribes were united under the Merovingians, who succeeded in conquering most of Gaul in the 6th century. The Franks became very powerful after this. The Merovingian dynasty, descendants of the Salians, founded one of the Germanic monarchies that would absorb large parts of the Western Roman Empire. The Frankish state consolidated its hold over the majority of Western Europe by the end of the 8th century, developing into the Carolingian Empire. This empire would gradually evolve into the state of France and the Holy Roman Empire. In the Middle Ages, the term Frank was used in the East as a synonym for Western European, as the Franks were then rulers of most of Western Europe. The Franks in the East kept their Germanic language and became part of the Germans, Dutch, Belgians and Luxembourgers. The Franconian languages, which are called Frankish in Dutch or Frankish in German, originated at least partly in the Old Frankish language of the Franks. Nowadays, the German and Dutch names for France are Frankreich and Frankreich, both meaning realm of the Franks. The name Franci was originally socio-political. To the Romans, Celts, and Suebi, the Franks must have seemed alike. They looked the same and spoke the same language, so that Franci became the name by which the people were known. Within a few centuries it had eclipsed the names of the original tribes, though the old names have survived in some place names, such as Hesse, which originates from the Chatti tribe. Following the precedents of Edward Gibbon and Jacob Grimm, the name of the Franks has been linked with the word Frank in English. It has been suggested that the meaning of free was adopted because, after the conquest of Gaul, only Franks were free of taxation. It is traditionally assumed that Frank comes from the Germanic word for javelin. There is also another theory that suggests that Frank comes from the Latin word Francisca, meaning words in other Germanic languages meaning fierce, bold, or insolent, may also be significant. Eumenius addressed the Franks in the matter of the execution of Frankish prisoners in the circus at Trier by Constantine I in 306 and certain other measures. Ubi nunc est illa ferocia, ubi semper infida mobilitas. Feroces was used often to describe the Franks. Contemporary definitions of Frankish ethnicity vary both by period and point of view. A formulary written by Markulf about 700 AD described a continuation of national identities within a mixed population when it stated that, all the peoples who dwell in the official's province, Franks, Romans, Burgundians and those of other nations, live according to their law and their custom. Writing in 2009, Professor Christopher Wickham pointed out that the word Frankish quickly ceased to have an exclusive ethnic connotation. North of the River Loire, everyone seems to have been considered a Frank by the mid-7th century at the latest. Romani were essentially the inhabitants of Aquitaine after that. Mythological Origins. The two earliest sources that describe the origin of the Franks are a 7th century work known as the Chronicle of Fredegar and the anonymous Liber Historiae Francorum, written a century later. Neither of these works are accepted by historians as trustworthy, compared with Gregory of Tours' Historia Francorum, which was written in the 6th century. The author of the Chronicle of Fredegar claimed that the Franks came originally from Troy and quoted the works of Virgil and Hieronymus, but the Franks are not mentioned in those works, except in a general way by Hieronymus. The chronicle describes Priam as a Frankish king whose people migrated to Macedonia after the fall of Troy. In Macedonia, the Franks then divided. The European Franks reached Francia under King Francio, just as Romulus went to Rome. Another branch, under King Turcote, became the Turks. Fredegar stated that Theodema, named king of the Franks by Gregory, was descended from Priam, Frigga and Francio. Another work, The Gesta, is nowadays acknowledged by serious scholars as a fantasy. Its author described how 12,000 Trojans, led by Priam and Antenna, sailed from Troy to the River Don in Russia, and, with a total disregard of geography, to Pannonia, which is on the River Danube, settling near the Sea of Azov. There they founded a city called Sicambria. The Trojans joined the Roman army in accomplishing the task of driving their enemies into the marshes of Meotis, for which they received the name of Franks. A decade later the Romans killed Priam and drove away Marcuma and Sarno, the sons of Priam and Antenna, and the other Franks. History. Early history. The appearance of the Franks. According to Sidonius Apollinaris, their eyes are faint and pale, with a glimmer of greyish-blue. Their faces are shaven all round, and instead of beards they have thin moustaches which they run through with a comb. Close-fitting garments confine the tall limbs of the men, they are drawn up high so as to expose the knees, and a broad belt supports their narrow middle. Apollinaris Sidonius. Letters. The major primary sources on the early Franks include the Panegyrici Latini, Ammianus Marcellinus, Claudian, Zosimus, Sidonius Apollinaris and Gregory of Tours. The Franks are first mentioned in the Augustan History, a collection of biographies of the Roman emperors. The Life of Aurelian, which was possibly written by Vopiscus, mentions that in 328, Frankish raiders were captured by the 6th Legion stationed at Mainz. As a result of this incident, 700 Franks were killed and 300 were sold into slavery. Frankish incursions over the Rhine became so frequent that the Romans began to settle the Franks on their borders in order to control them. In 292 Constantius defeated the Franks who had settled at the mouth of the Rhine. These were moved to the nearby region of Toxandria. Eumenius mentions Constantius as having killed, expelled, captured, and kidnapped the Franks who had settled there and others who had crossed the Rhine, using the term nationis Francae for the first time. The Salians, who eventually became the Merovingians, were first mentioned by Ammianus Marcellinus, who described Julian's defeat of the first Franks of all, those whom custom has called the Salians, in 358. He promoted them to the status of foederati within the empire. The 5th century Notitia Dignitatum lists their soldiers as soli. Jordanus, in Getica, mentions the Riparii as auxiliaries of Flavius Aetius during the Battle of Chalons in 451. Hienem affurant auxiliares. Franci, Sarmatae, Armoriciani, Laticiana, Burgundiones, Saxonies, Riparii, Alibriones. The Riparii may not have been the Ripuarian Franks, as they do not appear for certain under that name until their final subjugation by Clovis I. The Franks are mentioned in the Tabula Peutingeriana, an atlas of Roman roads. It is a 13th century copy of a 4th or 5th century document that reflects information from the 3rd century. The Romans knew the shape of Europe, but their knowledge is not evident from the map, which was only a practical guide to the roads to be followed from point to point. In the Middle Rhine region of the map, the word Francia is close to a misspelling of Bructeri. Beyond Mainz is Suvia, the country of the Suebi, and beyond that is Alemannia, the country of the Alemanni. 4 tribes at the mouth of the Rhine are depicted: the Chaucer, the Amziverii, the Cherish and the Chamavi, followed by Kie Pranci. The tabula was probably based on the Orbis Pictus, a map of 20 years' labor commissioned by Augustus and then kept by the Romans' treasury department for the assessment of taxes. It did not survive as such. Information about the imperial divisions of Gaul probably derives from it. Claudius Ptolemy's 2 maps of Germany portrayed Germania Inferior on the left bank of the Rhine, which was populated by Germanics, including those who had occupied the region before the Romans, and Magna Germania on the other side of the river, which acted as the Roman frontier. Tensions between the Empire and the Franks existed because of this artificial division. The Franks saw no reason why they should be kept from settling on either side of the river, and eventually they convinced the emperors to allow this to happen. The topography of the mouth of the Rhine was even more troubling. The Rhine divided far inland into a fan of outlets, in which there was a significant settlement area, the island of Batavia. The Romans diverted the Rhine into the Yssel through a canal, which emptied into an inland lagoon. After the construction of the canal, Batavia was left under Roman jurisdiction, although it was settled by Germanics. Ptolemy's maps reflect generally the same tribal names as the Tabula Peutingeriana, except that the tabula does not mention the Sicambri. This difference suggests that, in the few decades between the Ptolemaic map and the tabula, the Sicambri were absorbed by the Franks. Ripuarians. According to the ancient writers, the Franks emerged at the first half of the 3rd century from a number of earlier, smaller Germanic groups. The Sicambri, Chamavi, Brucheri, Chatti, Chatrurii, Amziverii, Tencteri and the Ubii, who inhabited the Rhine Valley from the Yssel between Lacus Flevo and Mainz. The Romans held Lacus Flevo and all the Martian riverland to the south. The Frankish Confederation probably began to coalesce in the 210s, north of the Roman province called Germania Inferior, which had been settled earlier by Celticized Germanic immigrants, known to Julius Caesar as the Belgae. Along the Rhine itself were a number of cities constituting the interface between Roman and Germanic civilization. Germanics who settled south of the Rhine without Roman authority were punished. Franks interested in reoccupying the Roman-controlled left bank of the Rhine marauded these Romans to the south by land and sea using the tactics of forced marches and surprise attacks. During the 3rd century, the Franks attempted to appropriate Batavia to the south of Lacus Flevo. This time the Romans allowed them to stay, settling them in Toxandria, where they became an independent maritime power known as the Salians, or maritime people. Other Franks, from Mainz to Duisburg, raided across the Rhine and at some point acquired the name Ripuarians, or river people. Both groups remained politically distinct until Clovis, a Salian and a member of the Merovingian dynasty, unified Francia. Salians. The Franks were described in Roman texts both as allies and enemies. About the year 261, group of Franks penetrated as far as Tarragona in present-day Spain, where they plagued the region for about a decade before they were subdued and expelled by the Romans. In 287 or 288, the Roman Caesar Maximian forced the Salian leader Genobode and his people to surrender without a fight. Maximian then forced the Salians in Toxandria to accept imperial authority, but was not able to follow on this success by reconquering Britain. Some decades later, the Salian Franks controlled the River Scheldt and were disrupting transport links to Britain in the English Channel. Although Roman forces managed to pacify them, they failed to expel the Franks, who continued to be feared as pirates at least until 358, when, according to the Roman historian Ammianus Marcellinus, Julian the Apostate allowed the Franks to settle as foederati in Toxandria. By the end of the 5th century, the Salian Franks had largely moved to a territory where they formed a kingdom that eventually gave rise to the Merovingian dynasty. Merovingian kingdom. Numerous small Frankish kingdoms existed during the 5th century around Cologne, Tournai, Le Mans, Cambrai and elsewhere. The kingdom of Tournai eventually came to dominate its neighbours, probably because of its association with Aegidius, the Magister Militum of northern Gaul. A Frankish king, Childeric I, fought with Aegidius in 463. Historians have assumed that Childeric and his son Clovis I were both commanders of the Roman military in the province of Belgica Secunda and were subordinate to the Magister Militum. Clovis later turned against the Roman commanders, defeated Syagrius in 486 or 487 and then had the Frankish king Caroric imprisoned and executed. A few years later, he killed Ragnachar, the Frankish king of Cambrai, and his brothers. By the 490s, he had conquered all the Frankish kingdoms to the west of the river Maas except for the Ripuarian Franks and was in a position to make the city of Paris his capital. He became the first king of all Franks in 509, after he had conquered Cologne. After conquering the kingdom of Soissons and expelling the Visigoths from southern Gaul at the Battle of Vouillé, he established Frankish hegemony over most of Gaul, excluding Burgundy, Provence and Brittany, which were eventually absorbed by his successors. Clovis I divided his realm between his 4 sons, who united to defeat Burgundy in 534. Internecine feuding occurred during the reigns of the brothers Sigebert and Chilperic I, which was largely fueled by the rivalry of their queens, Brunhilde and Fredegunda, and which continued during the reigns of their sons and their grandsons. 3 distinct sub-kingdoms emerged: Austrasia, Neustria and Burgundy, each of which developed independently and sought to exert influence over the others. The influence of the Arnulfing clan of Austrasia ensured that the centre of political gravity in the kingdom gradually shifted eastwards to the Rhineland. The Frankish realm was reunited in 613 by Clothar II, the son of Chilperic, who granted his nobles the Edict of Paris in an effort to reduce corruption and reassert his authority. Following the military successes of his son and successor Dagobert I, royal authority rapidly declined under a series of kings, traditionally known as les rois fainéants. After the Battle of Tertry in 687, each mayor of the palace, who had formerly been the king's chief household official, effectively held power until in 751, with the approval of the Pope and the nobility. Pepin the Short deposed the last Merovingian king Childeric III and had himself crowned. This inaugurated a new dynasty, the Carolingians. Carolingian Empire. The unification achieved by the Merovingians ensured the continuation of what has become known as the Carolingian Renaissance. The Carolingian Empire was beset by internecine warfare, but the combination of Frankish rule and Roman Christianity ensured that it was fundamentally united. Frankish government and culture depended very much upon each ruler and his aims, and so each region of the empire developed differently. Although a ruler's aims depended upon the political alliances of his family, the leading families of Francia shared the same basic beliefs and ideas of government, which had both Roman and Germanic roots. The sons of Louis the Pious fought a civil war after Louis's death, which ended when the Frankish lands were divided between them. Charles the Bald was given West Francia, which would later become France. Louis the German received the eastern lands, which would later become Germany, and Lothair I was given Middle Francia, which consisted of Lotharingia, Provence and northern Italy. Middle Francia was not united, and by the next generation it had disintegrated into smaller lordships, which West Francia and East Francia fought for control over.